what to expect and when. So we're showing here the returns of the S&P 500 and using those as a proxy for public pension fund investment returns. Of course, investment returns tend to not be as high as the S&P 500 because that's pure equities, but it is an indication of the strength of returns. And so we've got 3 fiscal years laid out here. The first one is shown in blue, and the investment return for the S&P 500 for that fiscal year was 5.4%. And we saw a moment ago that Vermont's investment return for the portfolio was 4.5%, above the national median of about 3.3%. And then there are many plans that have a fiscal year end date that is consistent with the calendar year end, 12/31. You can see the S&P performance for that period was 16.3%. And let's see, I believe that the median public pension fund investment return for that period was about 11%, 11 or 12%. And then we've just closed the fiscal year 21 for plans that have a fiscal year end date of June 30th. And that's where we really experienced some spectacular returns. Median return for public pension funds for the year ended 6/30/21 was around 25%. And Vermont reported a similar figure, right around 25%, a little north of that. But those are not being recognized yet actuarially. You should expect to see actuarial valuations for your statewide plans in December or January. And those actuarial valuations will be the first official glimpse you see of the effect on the plan's condition and funding level of these spectacular investment returns. And I'll finish this segment on returns with a sort of a sobering note, and that is projected returns by asset class. So Horizon Actuarial Services puts this together. They gather a consensus of blue chip market forecasters, and these are names that you would recognize. There's 20 or 25 nationally recognized investment consulting outfits that predict what asset classes will return, individual classes will return over the next 10 years or so. And you can see there's been a fairly steady decline in expected returns going forward. U.S. equities are the largest single component of most public pension portfolios. Also international equities, bonds, real estate is right up there. And so if one were to assemble a typical diversified portfolio, and if these returns were to be realized, we'd be looking at returns over the next decade of maybe 6 or 6.5%. So that spectacular 38% we saw in the S&P 500 last year may not be repeated anytime soon.
So the task force indicated an interest in discussing public pension plan amortization policies. And so we've prepared some material for that discussion. But before we transition to that subject, I want to pause and take another opportunity for any questions about the preceding investment discussion.
I do have one question.
So thank you. This is again, regarding the previous slide with the U.S. Treasuries, I would presume a lot of public pension plans are roughly 60-40 equities to treasuries, bonds, et cetera, cash-like instruments. And if they're paying below 2% going forward, obviously the hope is for most pension plans is for yields to creep on the treasury. But as long as we have a large and potentially growing debt, it would behoove the federal government to be able to afford that by keeping those yields low so that they can afford it. It makes it difficult for pension plans to make anything shy of, to try to reach their goals on an annual basis because they're plugging in 4% at below 2%. Are plans looking or changing from a 60-40 structure to something different?
Yes, sir, they are. They have been for some time. The structure in lieu of 60-40, I would say that on a broad level, the structure is something closer to 50-25-25. That's 50% U.S. and international equities, 25% bonds, not just U.S. Treasury, but also corporates and so forth. And then the other 25% so-called alternatives. That would be private equity, hedge funds, real estate.
Thank you.
I don't see any other questions, so go right ahead.
Great. So shifting focus to amortization policy, which we define here on this slide as the rules and processes that determine the length of time and the structure of payments required to systematically eliminate an unfunded liability or to recognize a surplus. And an amortization policy is an important component of a plan's funding policy and a key determinant of the plan's cost and funding outcomes. An amortization policy is defined further by several key elements, a non-exhaustive list of which are found on this slide. Is the amortization period open or closed? A closed amortization period essentially calls for the unfunded liability to be eliminated within a specified time frame. Conversely, an open or rolling amortization period essentially resets each year. A plan with a closed amortization period may choose to amortize the entire unfunded liability over the same period, or may instead use layered amortization, which is an approach that creates a new amortization schedule for each year's actuarial experience. Establishing the length of the amortization period is another important decision. All else equal, a longer amortization period will produce lower amortization payments relative to a shorter amortization period. But if that period is particularly lengthy, that may come at the expense of the plan's ability to address its obligations within a reasonable time frame. And then conversely, a shorter amortization period will result in higher payments and more rapid elimination of the unfunded liability. The amortization method is another important factor, and Keith alluded to this a little bit in his previous comments. Amortization payments may be determined as a constant percentage of payroll, with amortization payments expected to increase over time, commensurate with expected payroll growth. Or another approach is a level dollar approach, which produces amortization payments that are consistent in dollar terms on an annual basis. And again, this is not an exhaustive list. There are other important elements to amortization policy other than those listed here.
Alex, I've got another question in the queue.
Thanks, Alex. Again, regarding the layered amortization approach, how many of those 105 plans, how many plans are utilizing a layered amortization schedule for gains or losses, and is that a recent trend that is growing or shrinking, or what, please?
So we recently collected some pretty detailed information on amortization policies, including the use of layered and non-layered amortization. And we identify approximately 60% of the plans that we collected this information for, which is a little over 100 plans that are using closed amortization period, because layered versus non-layered is only relevant to plans that are using closed amortization. So 60% of plans using closed amortization periods are also using layered amortization. 40% of plans with closed amortization periods are using non-layered amortization. And you may also, wonder how many plans are using closed versus open amortization. The overwhelming majority, over 90% or so of the plans that we examined are using closed amortization. So of that, 90%, 60% of those are using layered amortization. And in terms of trends, we haven't, we've only collected this information for the most recent year, but our sense, and you can tell a little bit of this from the latest actuarial and financial reports, because they identify, the initial layered year, which in general corresponds to the year that the plan adopted layered amortization. Some plans have been using this approach for decades. I think, I've seen initial layered years of 1999, 2000, 2001, thereabouts. But I would say that the most common year of adoption is around 2013 to 2016 or so. So definitely for most plans, adoption of layered amortization has occurred more recently, but not necessarily in every case. So this slide, titled Amortization Policy Preferences, reflects material that is sourced largely from the paper, the white paper that is cited at the bottom of the slide, Actuarial Funding Policies and Practices for Public Pension Plans, which was published a couple of years ago by the Conference of Consulting Actuaries. And this paper is generally considered to be the gold standard resource for identifying amortization policy and recommended best practices. And we provide the citation here at the bottom. We'd be happy to provide you with a direct link to this resource following our presentation today as well, if you'd like. And what this paper recommends is the use of layered amortization, multiple fixed amortization layers. So a new layer for actuarial experience. Some plans also use different layers for different sources of unfunded liability, such as benefit increases or changes to actuarial methods or assumptions. Also can be reflected in their own layers. The paper identifies an ideal amortization period for actuarial experience gains and losses between 15 to 20 years. And they say further that an amortization period longer than 20 years becomes difficult to reconcile with demographic matching to promote the policy objective of intergenerational equity, basically meaning that the funding period is too long to be consistent with the objective to fund the pension plan over the generation that is expected to benefit from the public employees who are providing public services and earning those pension benefits. And then the paper also identifies the fact that a period shorter than 15 years can introduce untenable volatility in the cost of the plan and funding level. Obviously, amortization period that is exceptionally short will produce payments that are much higher relative to a longer period. And if the period is very short, then you can also have extreme volatility from year to year as those actuarial gains and losses are reflected over and funded over a shorter period of time. And so I mentioned we collected this information for about 100 or so statewide pension plans, including the state employees and teacher systems here in Vermont. And we identify that the amortization approach used by the retirement systems here in Vermont is a closed level percent of payroll approach, non-layered, and per statute scheduled to amortize in 2038. And so, pursuant to the material that we just saw on the last slide, as that date gets nearer, that 2038 date gets nearer, it could produce some exceptional volatility if the actuarial experience in those years, as we approach 2038, deviates significantly from actuarial assumptions. And so that's something to be aware of as that statutory date approaches. And so we're at another transition point here where we'd like to present and discuss the benefits comparison that we prepared and that I believe was distributed to all attendees of the task force in advance of this meeting. But before we move forward with that, just want to make sure that there aren't any questions about amortization policy or any of the preceding material.
Yes, we have a question.
Thank you for that presentation on amortization. It's very helpful. The Conference on Consulting Actuaries, with the recommendation for layered amortization, do they put forth a recommendation as far as funding, like, as level dollar or a percent of payroll?
This is Keith. I don't recall. As Alex indicated, we'd be happy to share that with you. I think that it's probably would be to the actuaries axiomatic that if you're not, if you don't have an expectation to be meeting your payroll growth assumption, you might be better off using level dollar, or else lowering your payroll growth assumption to better align with your experience. Because if you're trying to fund the plan at a payroll growth assumption that you're not reaching consistently, you're going to be underfunding your plan, and the cost is going to be rising. But we will take a look at that and get back.
Thank you.
Any other questions, folks? All right, I think we are ready to shift gears. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. As Alex indicated, we're going to take a look at this chart that we provided. Hopefully you all have a copy there, either electronically or a hard copy. And that is the handout. It's a one-pager that reads landscape benefit levels for general state employees and school teachers. Representative Gannon asked that we put this together. This is a comparison of the basic elements of retirement plan provisions for Vermont teachers and state employees and your regional peers there in New England and the state of New York. One takeaway that we'd like to leave with this chart is that a retirement benefit contains multiple components. We've tried to identify the primary components of a retirement benefit here on this chart. Social Security, of course. Alex, Alex talked a little bit about Social Security earlier. As a reminder, 25–30% of employees of state and local government in the United States do not participate in Social Security. That includes substantially all public employees in Massachusetts, many in Maine, some in Rhode Island. And so whether or not an employee participates in Social Security is an important consideration for obvious reasons in assessing their retirement benefit. You can also see the age and years of service. The information that's provided here relates to those employees who are hired today. Many or most of the plans that are listed here have so-called tiers. I think that Vermont also has tiers that are benefit levels for those who were hired previously. But for comparative purposes, we've provided the information just for those employees who are hired today. And so you can see the retirement multiplier, the age, years of service, a cost of living adjustment or post-retirement benefit enhancement, how much employees contribute. This is something Alex talked about earlier, the employer normal cost, how much the employer is contributing toward the normal cost, and then the total employer contribution. And so this, the information that's on here largely defines the normal cost. That's sort of how the actuaries determine the normal cost, is looking at taking into account all of these different factors. And so, you know, it's a little bit difficult to say, well, is Vermont better than or less than or more generous or less generous than the others? Because there's different buttons, different levers here, different points of emphasis. And Vermont might have a little bit more generous cost of living adjustment than some of your peers. But the retirement multiplier is a little bit lower compared to, say, Connecticut teachers. And for those in New York who work long enough, they can hit 2%. Then again, it's higher for some of the folks, the state employees in Connecticut and Rhode Island. They're participating in a hybrid plan. So it's difficult to say, you know, which is more generous. And that's why we like to look at the normal cost, because the normal cost is an indication of the overall cost of the plan. And even that is not perfect, but it's a better indicator.
I have a question for you. Andrew Emmerich, looking at the employee contributions, you said that the information here is based off from somebody being hired today, correct?
Yes, sir.
I believe the employee contributions for teachers is not 5%. I believe it is 6% for a change that happened back in 2010. Just a note.
Did you say for teachers is 6%?
Correct. So new teacher today, the employee contribution is 6%, not 5%.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry for that error, and we will correct it.
Thank you.
Are there other questions? We have more slides to go through if you
I
all
do
would.
have one question. Go ahead, Molly.
Hi, I'm Molly. I had a question in the age and years of service. I just want to understand that where it says like 63/10, 65/10. Does that mean those people after 10 years are getting full benefit?
So let's take New Hampshire, for example, 65 and 10. A New Hampshire public employee who has 10 years of service at age 65 will qualify for a full or unreduced retirement benefit. That's right.
Have the two together, age 65 and 10 years.
Yeah, I have to hit both there. There is an example or two of any here. In fact, you've got it for Vermont teachers, any age. I'm sorry, any years of service, any age in Connecticut if you've hit 35 years of service. But generally, when those two go together, you have to hit them both.
Okay, thank you.
So just to again clarify, I want to make sure I understand that also, Molly. Andrew speaking. So that means, for example, using New Hampshire, if you started teaching at 55 and then worked for 10 years, at 65, you've hit your age and you've worked for 10 years, so you're eligible to retire at that point with your full benefit?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Not shown on here are reduced retirement benefits, which most retirement systems provide, that will allow an employee to retire at an earlier age for what's typically an actuarial reduction or maybe a higher reduction than actuarial. But we did not show that on here.
All right, I have one more question.
Sorry, it's kind of a follow-up question, just to make sure I get that change, that different structure in those other states. So if you are working in the early part of your career for 25 years in New Hampshire, but you're not yet 65, you don't get your full benefit until you turn 65?
That's right. New Hampshire is effectively has said that they're not going to pay a retirement benefit for these employees until age 65. I think public safety has a lower threshold, but for general employees and teachers, that's right. You got to hit that age.
Thank you.
Right, so
If that, sorry, Alex, please go ahead.
I was just going to say if there are other questions, we'd be happy to take those at any point moving forward here. And but now we'll initiate a discussion of pension reform, which is somewhat related to the benefits comparison information that we just looked at. So we'll stay on this subject for most of the remainder of our presentation. So starting with this slide, talking about pension reforms in recent years, since 2009, corresponding with the Great Recession and the substantial increase in unfunded liabilities associated with the investment losses of 2007, 2008, and the corresponding recessions, which substantially challenged many public employers' ability to pay higher required costs to finance those newly created unfunded liabilities. Corresponding with those events, nearly every state modified public pension benefits, funding arrangements, or both. And we identify here on this slide a couple different ways in which plan designs were altered. Higher contributions is a big one, often from employees, usually from employers as well, and higher employer contributions could take the form in different cases of legislative enactments to increase statutory contribution rates, or just employers whose contribution rates are tied to actuarially determined rates having to pay more as those actuarially determined rates rose. Lower benefits was another common pension reform, and that took a number of different forms corresponding to some of those categories on the benefits comparison that Keith just described. Lower multipliers are probably the most direct way of reducing pension benefits. That change was, I think, in all or nearly all instances, aimed at new hires only, so exempting current active participants. More required years of service or a higher retirement age required to qualify for a normal or unreduced retirement benefit. And then another big category of changes was to post-retirement increases known as cost of living adjustments, COLAs. In many cases, those were reduced or in some cases even suspended or outright eliminated during this period. We saw an increased use of what is known as hybrid retirement plans, and we'll get into more detail on hybrid plans as we move forward. A major overarching theme of this period of pension reform has been the establishment or the clarification or strengthening of existing shared risk provisions, and the concept of risk and shared risk for public pension plans is something that we also will address in greater detail as we move forward in this section. And so this slide attempts to catalog our understanding of pension reform as you have experienced it here in Vermont. Our understanding is that legislation enacted in 2008 and again in 2011 increased the employee contribution rate for current active participants of the Vermont State Employees Retirement System. This change is pretty consistent with what other states have done, both in the type of change and who is affected. We saw many states increase employee contribution rates through legislation, and oftentimes those changes were directed to current active participants as well as new hires. For the teachers' retirement system, our understanding is that 2010 legislation specified a couple different plan design changes, including an increase to the employee contribution rate until such time as the teachers' system reaches a funding ratio of 90%. And as we saw earlier, the current funded ratio is just above 50, just above 51%. So that 90% threshold is likely a long ways off. And we saw also that that change was paired with an increase to the normal retirement eligibility requirement for some current active participants, specifically current active participants more than 5 years away from the previous requirement as of June 30th, 2010. And so that change was a little bit typical and non-typical. It was typical in the sense that many other states during this period chose to increase either the age, years of service, or both elements comprising normal retirement eligibility. But in most cases, those changes were aimed only at new hires, so exempting all current active participants. And so what makes Vermont a little bit unique in this regard is applying that increase to at least some current active participants. And then also a part of that 2010 legislative package was an increase to the benefit multiplier and the maximum benefit percentage. And this is also a little bit unique in the sense that it increased benefits for certain participants in most states. Pension reform legislation was solely meant to decrease benefits, and there was no corresponding benefit increases, at least in most cases. A couple considerations that we want to highlight with regard to pension reform. As I talked about a little bit on the previous slides, pension reform can be divided into one of two broad classes. Changes that affect future hires only, changes that affect current active participants as well. And current active participants could be further classified as those currently working and accruing service credit toward an eventual retirement benefit, or those who are already retired and receiving their retirement benefit. Most benefit changes in other states affected new hires only. Some, however, did affect current active participants, particularly changes to COLAs. The dominant affected group there was those currently retired and receiving benefits. Also, in some cases, current active participants had their COLAs modified during this period. Another consideration is that in order to reduce the plan's unfunded liability by benefit changes, which is oftentimes the goal of pension reform, that sort of necessarily requires that the benefit levels of current active participants or retirees be reduced. Obviously, future hires do not, there's no actuarial accrued liability for that group. There is only liability for your current active participants or your retirees. And so it sort of follows logically that if you want to reduce that liability through pension reform, then that's going to require making changes that affect either current active participants, retirees, or both. And then relatedly, this third point, reducing benefit levels only for future hires may alter the plan's cost trajectory, so may result in a change to the long-term cost curve, but that will take many decades to reflect in the condition and cost of the pension plan. And those types of reforms aimed at new hires only by themselves will not reduce the unfunded liability of the plan. And so then just further emphasizing that point, the most dramatic effects on unfunded liabilities have occurred by altering cost of living adjustments for current retirees. And this is the case because for many plans, including here in Vermont, as we'll look at in a moment, a substantial percentage of the actuarial accrued liability is committed to those who are currently retired and receiving benefits. So it then makes sense that the most significant changes to those liabilities will occur when benefits for those currently retired are modified. And typically that's done through modifying the cost of living adjustment rather than the base pension benefit that those retirees are receiving. So I'd like to turn it over to Keith to continue the pension reform discussion.
Thanks, Alex. So following on to what Alex just said, what actuaries will do in their valuation, you can find this in the valuations for these plans, is they will attribute the liabilities and the unfunded the liabilities associated with the different groups. And generally they divide these groups into two broad classes. One is actives, those who are working and contributing, and the other is inactives, which is those who are retired and receiving a benefit, and also those who have terminated but have kept their money with the system and presumably will retire at some date in the future. And so according to their actuarial valuations for the state employees, 62% of all of the liabilities in that plan are associated with folks who are retired or inactive, and 64% for the state teacher retirement system. What that means is those liabilities for those groups, for those plans, is fairly baked in. And really the only, if you wanted to affect those liabilities, if you wanted to reduce those for those who are not active, that would require a change to the cost of living adjustment provision that would affect those populations. You could also affect the liability associated with active members, and the way that we're not making a recommendation here, please don't misunderstand us. We're just talking in theory here. But the way to do that would be to reduce benefit levels going forward. We don't purport to speak to the legality of that or the political nature of that. We're just pointing out actuarial facts.
Thanks, Keith. So this slide will begin a series of maps that we've prepared and use regularly to communicate about pension reform. These maps provide a good indication of the scope of different types of pension reform nationwide, not necessarily the magnitude, but we think that they're very useful. Starting with states that have increased employee contribution rates since 2009, as we indicate here, 38 states have made this change, and the magnitude of these increases to employee contribution rate varies across states. In some cases, the increases were substantial. In other cases, phased or incremental. Some of the majority of these increases affected current active participants, although some increased employee contribution rates applied only to new hires. There are a couple of states that were non-contributory prior to enacting for the first time an employee contribution rate for some of their participants. You might also be wondering why two of the states appear to be shaded differently. That would be Utah and Maine. And that sort of feeds into a subject that we're going to get into in greater detail later, of shared risk and very specifically variable contribution rates. Utah and Maine passed legislation that provided for the potential for employee contribution rates to rise. But so far, those increases, the conditions required to produce those increased employee contribution rates have not yet materialized. So we thought it was appropriate to indicate them differently here on this map. Next, we're looking at states that reduced pension benefits since 2009, 40 states indicated here on this map. And again, corresponding to the introductory slide, this would reflect all of those different ways that we identified in which pension benefits, base or core pension benefits can be reduced. So this is lower multipliers, longer vesting periods, increased normal retirement eligibility requirements, either a higher retirement age or more years of service required to qualify for an unreduced retirement benefit. All of that reflected in this map. And again, the magnitude of the changes and who was affected by the changes will vary from state to state. And then next, we're looking at states that have made adjustments to cost of living adjustments since 2009. And COLA changes fell into one of three broad categories generally, represented by the different color shading on this map. States shaded in green made changes to COLAs affecting new hires only. That's easily the minority of changes aimed at new hires only. States shaded in blue made changes affecting current employees and new hires, and so all the changes indicated here on this chart flow down. So if current active participants were getting their COLA modified, those modifications also pertained to new hires as well. And then the overwhelming majority of COLA changes, as indicated by the states shaded in beige, affected current retirees as well. And these changes could be anything from lowering the COLA percentage to eliminating the COLA outright or suspending it, sometimes indefinitely, sometimes until a designated funded ratio is reached, or sometimes for a specific period of time, such as 2 or 3 years. 30 states made changes to COLA since 2009, which is certainly lower than the number of states that increased employee contributions or lowered benefits. But it's worth pointing out the fact that not every state provides an automatic cost of living adjustment to its public employees, its retired public employees. So states such as Texas, Pennsylvania, Georgia, North Carolina, and others only provide ad hoc cost of living adjustments, which require the approval of an external entity such as the legislature or the retirement board in order to grant that benefit. So effectively, those states that don't provide an automatic COLA didn't have a benefit to cut or modify. But in many cases, those states that only provide ad hoc COLAs have also not granted that benefit in a significant amount of time. And so we're going to move next to a discussion of risk sharing and shared risk elements of public pension plan design, which I'd like to ask if Keith would present.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, as Alex indicated, risk sharing has been a dominant theme of pension reform over the last decade or so, perhaps matched by just outright lower benefit levels or higher employee contributions. But aside from those, we've seen an awful lot of risk sharing provisions. The universal retirement equation that we sometimes refer to, C plus I equals B plus E. The money that comes in has to equal the money out. Contributions plus investment earnings equals benefits plus expenses. It's a simple mathematical reality. You can't pay a benefit with money that you don't have. So over time, the money that's coming in, the money that's going out has got to equal at least the money that comes in. And in a traditional, at least theoretical, defined benefit or pension plan, if it happens that revenues are not sufficient to pay benefits, contribution rates need to rise. More often than not, those higher contribution rates have come from employers, not always, but usually. And the idea of risk sharing brings in the chance that employee contributions or benefit levels could be adjusted under conditions like that when there is projected to not be enough revenue or assets to pay promised benefits. Three broad types of risk that retirement plans encounter: investment risk, the risk that investment performance may fall short of the assumption or expectation; inflation risk, the risk that inflation will erode the purchasing power of a retirement benefit, and then longevity risk, how long people will live. And if you've got a group of retirees who are outliving their expectations in a pension plan, it comes at the cost of the plan. If it's a defined contribution or an individual retirement account, then that risk is borne by the individual. They have a risk of outliving their retirement assets. But at a high level, 3 types of risk that pension plans must consider, and the plan design is based around. So as I mentioned, in a traditional defined benefit plan, the employer has borne all of the risk, but that traditional theoretical plan really has not been in place in the public sector, certainly not for many years for most plans. Increasingly, especially over the last decade, but incrementally over the last 20 or 30 years, we've seen more and more risk moved to be borne by employees. And we now see a fairly wide array of levels of risk and types of risk that are borne by employees. As you might expect in a typical defined contribution plan, an employee bears all or nearly all of the risk. How long they're going to live, how much they contribute, how their investment performance is, and so forth. In a traditional pension plan, employers, as we mentioned, typically bear all or most of the risk. But in reality, in current public pension plans that we see across the country, we've seen this wide array of risk sharing between employees and employers. And again, the predominant theme we've seen in recent years is a shifting of different kinds of risk to different degrees from employers to employees. So this is a continuum that NASRA put together that's intended to sort of illustrate this risk. It's obviously not a binary thing. It occurs on a continuum. There's lots of shades of gray in here. And so on the left-hand side, you really have your, excuse me, you have your traditional corporate pension plan. And corporate pension plans don't have employee contributions. The employer contributes all of that. The employer bears all of the risk. And that is the plan that is mostly gone away in the private sector. There's not very many employees in the private sector that are participating in a traditional defined benefit plan. And the public sector generally probably falls around 10 or 11 o'clock on this, if you think of it as a clock, where you've got a defined benefit plan in place, but the employees are sharing some of that risk. And then toward the top of that, about noon on the thinking of it as a clock, you've got traditional hybrid plans, combination defined benefit, defined contribution plans, where risk is fairly evenly distributed between employees and employers, cash balance plans similarly. And a moment ago, Alex referred to these plan designs that we'll talk in more detail about in a moment, in which benefit levels or employee contribution rates might change. And then as you get over to the right-hand side of the chart, you get into defined contribution plans with reducing levels of employer participation and risk.
So beginning with this slide, we move from the theoretical to the practical examples of risk sharing among public pension plans. Before we move forward, I'd like to pause and ask if there's any questions.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions going back to some of the benefit changes side. One's just a simple, first is a simple clarification, and this is Eric speaking as well. You said that most benefit changes have not focused on current actives, but some of those are previously implemented in Vermont did. Is that correct? I think that mainly applies to the teacher system.
Yes, I think I indicated that Vermont is not an outlier in the sense that you made benefit reductions, but you are somewhat of an outlier in the sense that those benefit reductions affected some current active participants rather than just new hires, which was the prevailing approach in other states. And it's worth mentioning, as Keith alluded to in one of his earlier remarks, that states differ with regard to their legal protections for accrued pension benefits. And so those, differences in legal protections will limit, in some cases, the extent of the reforms that can be applied to different groups. Some states, have legal prohibitions against making changes to pension benefits for current employees at all. So effectively, those states don't have that option to do what you did here in Vermont.
Thank you. Two more questions. You mentioned, I believe it was West Virginia at one point, in that they really improved their funded ratio, doing so without benefit changes. So I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more to the strategies they've implemented.
I'll take a shot at that. What West Virginia did was just made a focused and concerted effort to fund their plan. You all might remember the tobacco settlement monies, where every state got some money from the big lawsuit that was filed against the big tobacco companies. And West Virginia applied a good portion of that, I think like $800 million, to pay down the unfunded liability of the teacher retirement system. On a few occasions, when they had budget surpluses, they applied a portion of those budget surpluses to pay down their unfunded liability. So it was mostly just through an effort to fund their plan.
Thank you. The last question goes to that attribution of risk, and it's something we've discussed a little bit here as a task force. That we have certain targets that are in our enacting legislation. They relate to how the unfunded liability and ADEC have increased since we made assumption changes primarily. And those assumption changes affect, all plan participants, retirees, those close to retirement, and current actives. Yet we've been trying to be thoughtful about how those groups are affected, and I think that it brings in, considerations of intergenerational equity. That essentially you may have a smaller group responsible for liabilities accrued over a larger group. Do you have any thoughts on how to consider intergenerational equity in our work here?
I guess I might say that the big challenge of providing a retirement benefit requires quite a balancing act. You've got to accommodate the needs and demands and expectations of different your major stakeholder groups. And who are those groups? Well, those are employees, of course, who public employers need to attract and retain. You've got employers that need to attract and retain. And then you've got taxpayers who are paying a good portion of the cost of the benefit. And it's very easy to develop a retirement plan that favors one group over those others. But ultimately, for a retirement plan to be effective and to be sustainable, it's got to meet the needs of all of those groups. And that's really the big challenge. So, right now, I suppose that you could come up with a plan design that significantly lowers benefits for new hires, or say those who are not yet vested in your plan, and spares everybody else, including taxpayers and retirees and actives who've been there a longer period of time. The problem is that employers especially are going to have a much more difficult time attracting and retaining qualified workers. So whatever changes are going to be made have got to keep in mind the needs of balancing those needs of different stakeholder groups.
Thank you.
I have a question. Andrew speaking, I'm going back a little far, I think, to the extra handout talking about the benefit levels in Vermont, New York, New Hampshire, Maine, Mass, Connecticut, Rhode Island. I was just wondering, do you have the average benefit payout for the different states and the different sections? if you don't have that on hand, is that something you could get to us? And I would also just be kind of curious to know what the funding ratio is of these different states. And also thinking back to a previous slide where it was looking about the financial percentage commitment towards pensions for the entire state budget, I believe.
Yeah, the average pay, the average payout is a knowable figure, and we're happy to get that for you, although I would caution that pension payouts will vary by employee group. Teachers tend to have the most longevity. Teachers tend to work a full career or more so relative to general employees. And so in a typical plan, average years of service for a teacher will be 25 or 30 years, whereas the average tenure for a general employee will be maybe half of that or perhaps less. And so if you were to get that data, the average pension payout, say for the Massachusetts or the Massachusetts teacher retirement system, that will be different than that of the state employees retirement system. But those will be different from the New Hampshire retirement system. The New Hampshire retirement system is unified. They put them all together there. You've got all the public safety and the state employees and local government employees and teachers as well. And so there's limited utility in comparing the average pension payout. It's just important to be sure one is comparing apples to apples. But we'd be happy to get that information for you.
Thank you for that explanation. That makes sense. Appreciate it.
And sorry, one other thought, and that is, of course, the availability of, or not of Social Security.
Right.
So Alex, is this yours or mine?
This is mine. I'll present the next couple slides and then give you an opportunity to make some final remarks. So as I mentioned, we're going to move away from the theoretical discussion of risk sharing toward the practical application of risk sharing to public pension plans. We'll talk about a couple specific examples of risk sharing plan design elements that are here listed on this slide: flexible employee contribution rates, adjustable benefit levels, hybrid plans, and contingent or limited cost of living adjustments. So first, we have another map. This is identifying states that added shared risk plan design elements since 2009. In some cases, some of these states had previously implemented shared risk plan design elements, but they made some change to strengthen or clarify those elements. And again, just like the other maps, this is provides a good indication of the scope of activity in this area, not necessarily the magnitude. All different magnitude of changes reflected in this map. But almost half of the country since 2009 has implemented what we would characterize as a risk sharing plan design element in accordance with one of those different example elements listed on the previous slide since 2009. And we expect more states to adopt risk sharing plan design elements moving forward. And we're going to go through some examples of risk sharing elements that have been used in the public sector. And Keith, why don't you start us off and just take this as far as you're able, and I'll pick it up after you.
Thank you. So these are some examples of contribution rates for employees that can vary. In these states, the Arizona State Retirement System, Nevada PERS, which Arizona State Retirement System excludes public safety personnel. It's teachers and state employees and local government workers who are not police officers and firefighters. Nevada, this pertains to just about everybody there. And Wisconsin, same thing, just about everybody. The full contribution rate is shared equally between the employer and the employee. Maine is interesting. It's very similar, 55-45 split, but there's an upper limit on the amount that the employee, as a percentage of pay that employees are required to pay. Similarly, Iowa, 60-40 employer-employee split. All new hires in California, and this pertains to teachers and participants in CalPERS. It does not necessarily include some of the other plans. They are required to split the normal cost between employees and employers at least. So employees must pay at least 1/2 of the normal cost. And then, as the notation indicates, many employees in Montana and North Dakota are contributing at a rate that is promised to decline when the plan funding level reaches a future designated threshold. And we would note that when you link the employee contribution rate to the plan's actual cost, that is exposing employees to all of the plan's risks, inflation, longevity, investment performance, and so on, because all of that is borne out ultimately in the contribution. On the other side of the ledger, flexible benefits. Michigan enacted an unusual and I think interesting plan design a few years ago. Newly hired school teachers in Michigan since 2018, excuse me, participate in a plan that is measured annually. And when the actuary finds that the mortality or longevity experience has improved by at least 1 year, that is when teachers in that plan are found to be projected to live at least 1 year longer, then the normal retirement age for that plan ticks up by 1 year. And whenever it hits a full year, that required retirement age ticks up 1 as well. Your neighbors to your north, New Brunswick, Canada, they provide an interesting plan. It's basically a hybrid, contains 2 basic components. Core benefit, you might think of as a typical pension plan, and a second component that is variable. That benefit at retirement could vary depending on the investment performance and the actuarial experience of the plan. And then a few years ago in Texas, Houston employees, and this pertains to all employees in the city, firefighters, police officers, and general employees, participated in a plan in which they set a target employer contribution rate. And if or when that required contribution rate strays from that target by more or less than 5%, then a series of triggers sets in that begin with reduction in benefits, may also include changes in contribution rates and actuarial methods and assumptions. So as long as the employer contribution rate stays within that range, benefits and contributions stay the same. But if the experience causes the required contribution rate to get outside of that range, then there's a series of very specific changes that begin to take effect.
I have a question, Andrew speaking, thinking of the Michigan Public Schools retirement system. Would the opposite be true if the mortality decreased by a full year, that the retirement age as well decreases?
That's a good question. I'm not sure when they established that plan that they thought about that. And I don't know. We'll be happy to look. Let's hope that does not materialize, but we'll look to find out for you.
Yes, fingers crossed. Just curious. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would also take the opportunity to point out another feature of that plan design for Michigan Public Schools, and that is that individuals who are within a certain number of years from qualifying for the existing normal retirement age, I believe 5 years out from qualifying for the existing normal retirement, are exempted from any increases. So those closest to retirement are that change that increase is not applied to those participants.
Yeah, great point, Alex. Thanks for sharing that. And members, I have to apologize. I literally have to go catch a plane. And so I have to go, but I'm going to leave this in the hands of my capable colleague, Alex. And it's been an honor and a privilege to be with you. We'll do our best to get back with you with some of the unanswered questions. And of course, you should always feel free to reach out to us if you have questions about public pension issues. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for being with us today.
Okay, so we don't have too much further to go as far as the prepared material, and then we can take some questions at the end here. So I mentioned another example of risk sharing elements of public plan design is hybrid plans, and undoubtedly you've heard a lot about hybrid plans, probably know a little bit, but we'll just go over generally the 2 most commonly recognized types of hybrid plans. The first so-called combination hybrid plans or DB/DC hybrid plans. A combination hybrid plan provides a benefit comprised of multiple elements, a more modest traditional pension plan combined with mandatory or at least default participation in a defined contribution plan. And the way that this plan shares risk is obviously employees bear all or most of the risk within the DC plan component, and the employer is bearing some of the risk associated with the defined benefit plan, but that risk is lower because the defined benefit portion of the hybrid plan is lower compared to a standalone defined benefit plan. So there's a balance of risk sort of inherent with these combination hybrid plans. Another commonly recognized type of hybrid plan is a so-called cash balance plan. A cash balance plan provides a retirement benefit based on the accumulated balance of a notional or hypothetical retirement account that provides participants with a maximum annual interest crediting rate. Employer risk in cash balance plans is lower because generally that maximum interest crediting rate is lower than the plan's assumed rate of investment return. Many cash balance plans do provide the opportunity for excess interest credits above that interest crediting rate, typically dependent on favorable investment performance. So there's a little bit of a shared gain component to cash balance plans as well, to the extent that employees may share in that strong investment performance through increased cash balance interest credits. And in most cash balance plans, all or at least a portion of the benefit is available to be annuitized upon attainment of certain retirement eligibility criteria. So sort of similar characteristically to traditional pension benefit that is paid in the form of a lifetime annuity. Cash balance plans in many cases have that same ability to pay that benefit as a form of an annuity as well. And so hybrid plans have certainly grown in popularity in recent years, but they have been in place in the public sector in some states for a very long period of time. So we're looking back to 1995. This is a heat map, so the darker the shade of the state, the greater percentage of public employees in that state participating in one of those two hybrid plan types. So when we go back almost 3 decades ago to 1995, we see that there were hybrid plans in effect in 2 states, Texas and Indiana. In Indiana, for substantially all public employees for a very long time, going back to the late 1940s, in fact, is the hybrid plan in Indiana. And then in Texas, similarly, going back to the 1950s or so, for municipal and county employees in that state who participate in a cash balance plan. And then we fast forward to the present day, and we see that there are many more states that have adopted hybrid plans. But it is also the case that many of these new hybrid plans applied only to new hires. So their percentages of public employees participating in these new hybrid plans is still very low in many of these cases. Virginia, Tennessee, and Kansas are good examples of states that applied, that created new hybrid plans for substantially all newly hired public employees in those states. And you can see their participation thresholds are still pretty low, but are expected to increase as employees in the previous tiers retire and are replaced by hybrid plan participants. There's a pretty interesting contrast going on in New England between Connecticut and Rhode Island. Connecticut created a new hybrid plan a couple of years ago that was typically applied to new hires only, and so therefore less than 5% of public employees currently in that state are participating in the hybrid plan. Teachers were also exempted from that new hybrid plan in Connecticut as well, so only applied to certain state employees. And then Rhode Island, on the other hand, created a hybrid plan about a decade or so ago, but rather than apply that change only to new hires, certain current active participants were also required to participate in that hybrid plan, which results in a participation rate of over 75% and growing. And so you can just sort of see the relative popularity of hybrid plans and the level of participation in those states that have adopted hybrid plans on this map.
I have a quick question. Andrew speaking, thinking about Texas from 1995 to 2021. Am I reading it correctly that previously Texas was 26 to 40% of participants in hybrids, but now it's 11 to 25%? Is that correct?
Yeah, so that's just sort of a statistical anomaly. The employee groups covered by the hybrid plan in Texas up until a couple months ago was just county employees and municipal employees. And so, in 1995, those participants represented, 26% or greater of all public employees in Texas. And then, I guess here by 2021, there have been more teachers and, state employees hired that have driven that percentage of county and municipal employees to be lower than 26%, and therefore within that 11 to 25% category. But it's pretty consistently, 25 to 27% or so. Now we will expect to see that percentage increase in Texas because a couple months ago, the Texas legislature established a new cash balance plan for newly hired state employees in 2022 and onward, I believe. So now, in addition to the county and municipal employees who have been participating as a longstanding matter in cash balance plans, you'll also have the state employees. So that participation threshold in Texas will be expected to rise moving forward.
Thank you.
And so we also mentioned another method in which public pension plans share risk among employers and participants is through a contingent or limited cost of living adjustments. And broadly speaking, contingent or limited COLA refers to a post-retirement benefit adjustment whose amount, or in some cases whose provision, depends on some external factor, such as the investment return, the plan's funding level, perhaps the rate of price inflation in the economy, or some other factor. And there are a number of examples here in which contingent COLAs can be made to be contingent or limited, including delayed onset or minimum age. So you have to be retired for a certain number of years before you can receive a COLA, or have attained a minimum age, such as 65 or 67 or something like that, to begin receiving a COLA. So effectively, in those examples, the employee or the participant is responsible for bearing all of the inflation risk up to the point at which they're eligible to receive a COLA. So if that's 2 years or 4 years out of retirement, they're responsible effectively for bearing the inflation risk up to that point. Other plans apply the COLA only to a portion of the pension benefit. So the first, say, $10,000 in pension benefits is eligible to receive a COLA. And for the rest of the benefit, the participant is bearing the inflation risk for any benefits that they're receiving that are not covered by a COLA. And then COLAs that are linked to investment performance or linked to plan funding level, those COLA designs are effectively sharing all of the different types of risk, inflation, longevity, and investment, because to the extent that those different actuarial factors can affect the funding level of the plan, then the participants are essentially exposed to those risks through a COLA linked to the plan funding level. And we conclude with a handout of COLA arrangements that I think was distributed in advance of this meeting. I'm going to attempt to share it here on the screen in case anybody does not have a copy, and we can quickly go over that resource. So hopefully this is presenting on your screen there in the room. What this handout is identifying is a little bit greater detail of the variations to cost of living adjustments among public retirement systems. and we list some specific examples according to these different contingent or limited COLA categories, including delayed onset, minimum age. And you can see the variation here in a delayed onset or minimum age COLAs. Retirees or participants hired since 2015 in the state of Nevada receive a COLA only after 3 years of receiving benefits. And then that COLA increases as a percentage the longer that the participant has been retired. So that's sort of an interesting spin on the delayed onset concept. And then you can see your neighbor to the west here, New York State and Local Retirement System and New York State Teachers Retirement System. Participants who retire from those systems have to meet a certain age and years of service requirement to begin to receive a COLA. So if the participant retires before meeting those requirements, then they're not eligible to receive a COLA until they have attained those ages. Some plans provide COLAs that are non-compounded. So a compounded COLA provides an increase not just on the base retirement benefit, but also on COLAs that have been awarded previously. Simple COLA, by contrast, applies that benefit only to the original base benefit. And so we identify 3 plans that provide only a simple COLA, or 3 examples, I should say, of plans that provide a simple COLA. One plan, Mississippi Public Employees, provides a simple COLA until reaching age 60, and then adds the compounding effect thereafter. So I mentioned earlier in the pension reform discussion that a number of plans effectively suspended their COLAs, with the suspension sometimes term specific. Colorado Para for 2 years, and then up in Maine for 3 years, and you can see some other examples. Another method of implementing a COLA suspension is to essentially suspend the COLA indefinitely, as New Jersey did, until the plans reach a designated funding level, which is going to be pretty far off in New Jersey. They've got pretty poorly funded pension plans, so their participants are not going to receive a COLA for some time. Another common method of providing COLAs is to tie the benefit to investment performance. A number of states adopt that approach. Among the more interesting approaches is that which is used in South Dakota. So South Dakota's sort of an interesting example in that they're statutorily required to maintain a funding level on a market basis of 100%. And if they fall below that threshold, they're required to take corrective actions to bring themselves back within 100% funding on a market basis. And so to accomplish that, they've got this pretty interesting COLA design where the COLA is linked to the annual rate of inflation with a maximum of 3.5% and a minimum of 0%, and is further determined by the COLA that is payable, given the plan's recent actuarial experience, that would result in maintaining a funded ratio of at least 100%. So effectively, they pay annually in COLA what they can afford to pay while maintaining a 100% funded ratio. So if they can't pay a COLA without dipping below 100% funded, then the COLA for that year is 0. And similarly, if they can pay 1.5 or 2.5%, whatever, depending on the rate of inflation as well, and maintain that 100% funded ratio, then that's what they pay in that year. So it varies depending on their expected funding condition. And then finally, we list a couple examples where the COLA is applied only to a portion of the benefit, in some cases also with delayed onset. So again, in these cases where COLA is applied only to a portion of the benefit, you've got a shared risk situation going on up until the portion of the benefit that the COLA applies to, and then for any additional benefit that the participant is receiving, they're effectively responsible for dealing with the inflation risk on that excess benefit. And that's the conclusion of our prepared material. And if there are any additional questions about this section or anything that Keith or I discussed previously, I'd be happy to do my best to address them now.
Go ahead.
Andrew speaking. Questions particular to this, the presentation was great. Thank you for all that information. I'm curious if you can speak to changes that any states implemented that they thought would be impactful that backfired, and actually did not have the determined impact, the desired.
Yeah, I can give you a couple specific examples. So one change that was pretty commonly enacted since 2009 that we didn't spend a lot of time discussing, but is relevant to this question, is increases to the vesting requirement. So otherwise known as the amount of time an employee must work in order to qualify to receive an eventual pension benefit. Prior to 2009, it was typical to see vesting periods of 3 to 5 years. And following this period of significant pension reform, we began to see vesting periods of much higher than that, sometimes 7 years, sometimes as many as 10 years that a new hire must work to qualify to receive a benefit from the plan. And at least 2 examples I can think of, and there may be more, vesting periods were increased, and then those increases were rolled back after the public employers in those states experienced difficulty attracting and retaining public workers who were leaving, potentially not choosing to work for a public employer because of an exceptionally lengthy vesting period, or who were deciding to leave public service because they didn't think that they would meet that lengthy vesting requirement. So that's one very specific example of a change. And furthermore, I believe in those states that implemented longer vesting periods, those changes were not found to be substantial drivers of cost reduction. So not only, were they not saving any money, but they were jeopardizing public employers' ability to attract and retain the type of talented workers they were trying to recruit to public service. Excuse me.
Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, I'd like to echo Andrew's comments on just thanking you for the presentation. It's a lot of food for thought, really helpful. One item we discussed as a task force is, and this goes back to one of your first slides and looking at things that work for a pension plan and against it, is how to incentivize people to actually work longer. And we've talked about some ideas, but I'd just be interested if you've seen states do anything interesting in that regard, or any other incentives to kind of drive the behavior that would result in cost savings.
Sure. So obviously, the most direct incentive, for employees to work longer would be to increase either the required age and or years of service required to attain a normal or unreduced retirement benefit. That can provide a significant incentive to work longer, to be able to eventually receive a retirement benefit that's not subject to actuarial reduction. Another example that we've seen, and we could provide specific examples if you're interested, is an escalating multiplier. So the way that works is, you've got a benefit multiplier. You've got different levels of benefit multipliers that correspond to different lengths of service. And I think New Mexico implemented this most recently for their teachers plan. So they've got a lower multiplier for those who retire with 10 years of service, and then it's correspondingly higher as you go up the number of years of service, resulting in a maximum multiplier at say 25 or 30 years of service. And so that can provide an incentive to work longer to receive an eventual retirement benefit that's calculated on the basis of a higher multiplier.
Thank you.
Any other questions from task force members about this information we've been presented this morning? Yep, I have one question.
Sir, one thing I was thinking about based on the presentation is whether, there might be a couple of specific states that have recently gone through some reform initiatives in the last, 2, 3, 4, 5 years that are similar to Vermont. That would be good to hear from them directly. If you had any that, jumped to you in Maine and Rhode Island to me, just because they're New England states and they took a couple of different approaches. I think it'd be interesting to hear from them as to why or why not certain approaches were taken. But, those states or any other states, if you have any recommendations on that.
Well, so, every state is unique in several regards. And, some states and some plans that are in geographic proximity to you in Vermont are different in important ways that, make them perhaps not appropriate comparative states. Maine and Massachusetts might be good examples of that. Participants or public employees, I should say, in those states, substantially all public employees in those states are outside Social Security. So those states have sort of a different, benefit framework that they're operating under, in the sense that the benefits they provide, are generally more generous than those provided by states whose public employees are also covered by Social Security, because they've got to compensate for the lack of expected Social Security income. So when we look at states that are, whose situation is appropriately comparative to Vermont's, it's important to consider factors like that. But we could certainly give that some thought and maybe provide some specific examples of states that are, we think are characteristically similar to Vermont, whether they're in geographic proximity or elsewhere, that might be interesting and relevant to compare from a pension reform perspective.
That'd be great.
Go ahead, Peter.
Thank you. So different states fund their pensions different, I'm sure. In Vermont, our total pension and OPEB liability cost is approaching closely 14% of our general fund revenue on an annual basis. And it's getting difficult to afford that. It's up there. For example, I read once that New Jersey actually increased tolls on the Garden State Parkway or the New Jersey Turnpike or both. And that money actually goes to reduce the unfunded liability. But do you have some kind of a presentation or a chart or whatever that demonstrates what different states do?
So, yeah, with regard to New Jersey and the toll revenue, that we refer to examples like that as so-called dedicated funding sources or dedicated revenue sources. Basically, revenue streams that have been established for exclusive purpose of delivering extra revenue to the pension plan for purposes of reducing the unfunded liability. New Jersey's a good example. A couple of years ago, they dedicated the lottery fund and the annual lottery fund proceeds to paying down the unfunded pension liability of their pension plans. There are another number of other arrangements, particularly states whose revenue is dependent on the taxes levied on the extraction of natural resources. So like Montana, Louisiana, coal and oil states have in recent years established dedicated revenue sources tied to a percentage of those natural resource taxes to fund their pension plans. We do list a number of those and similar examples on our website. That's NASRA.org. Under the funding policies topic page, you can find a list of other states and local governments that have implemented dedicated revenue sources to fund their pension plans. I guess, the challenge there is that that's then, pulling revenue away from, potentially another source to fund the pension plan. So it's not necessarily, creating new revenue. It's just moving it around, from one place to another.
Andrew, I have another question. So again, the benefit levels for kind of the Northeast states compared to Vermont, it's really useful to have. Is it possible to get information for kind of states similar to Vermont spread out around the country? Thinking California wouldn't be a great comp, but are there some other states where we could get some info like Vermont?
Yeah, we can certainly pull something together. One factor that we've looked into a little bit is different states' level of urbanization. Urbanization defined as the percentage of the total state's residents living in or near cities. And in general, we find that states with a higher percentage of urbanization generally provide higher pension benefits, accounting for these factors like that we've discussed, like Social Security participation or lack thereof. And so that might be one metric within which to develop a comparative group, including Vermont, would be to look at states whose level of urbanization is similar to yours here in Vermont. Vermont's obviously one of the least urbanized states in the country.
And I have one other question. One of the things we've been talking about as an idea is possibly giving people the option to opt into increased employee contributions in return for years of service credit. Are there any states doing something similar like that? Some creative thoughts?
I think there are examples. In Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania legislature a couple years ago implemented a new tier for newly hired state employees and public school employees. And that new tier includes an elective option for those new participants where they can elect to choose between either a pure defined contribution plan or one of two hybrid plans. And the two hybrid plans have different employee contribution rates and different multipliers. So essentially, if you want to receive a higher benefit, you can opt into doing so by paying a higher employee contribution rate. If you want to retain more of your take-home pay, you can pay less in employee contributions and receive a less generous retirement benefit. So that's one example that comes to mind, and there are likely others as well.
All right, any other questions from task force members? All right, well, Alex, I want to say thank you again for being with us this morning, bringing us a wealth of information that I suspect will take most of us a little time to digest. And I do appreciate your willingness to follow up with answers to a few of our questions. And so thank you so much. I think we're done here for this morning. And Alex, you have a great day.
My pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss these issues with you this morning. We do intend to follow up, and we would encourage you to reach out to us if you have any questions or wish to continue the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, that puts
No
us,
idea what time it is.
it is 11:45 and that puts us at a much needed lunch break.
Back at 1.